Generating good research questions. The learning objectives for this section are: describe some techniques for turning research ideas into empirical research questions and use those techniques to generate questions. Explain what makes a research question interesting and evaluate research questions in terms of their interestingness. Generating empirically testable research questions. Once you have a research idea, you need to use it to generate one or more empirically testable research questions. That is, questions expressed in terms of a single variable or relationship between variables. One way to do this is to look closely at the discussion section in a recent research article on your topic. This is the last major section of the article, in which the researchers summarize the results, interpret them in the context of past research, and suggest directions for future research. These suggestions often take the form of specific research questions, which you can then try to answer with additional research. This can be a good strategy because it's likely that the suggested questions have already been identified as interesting and important by experienced researchers. But you may also want to generate your own research questions. How can you do this? First, if you have a particular behavior or psychological characteristic in mind, you can simply conceptualize it as a variable and ask how frequent or intense it is. How many words on average do people speak per day? How accurate are our memories of traumatic events? What percentage of people have sought professional help for depression? If the question's never been studied scientifically, which is something you'll learn when you conduct your literature review, then it might be interesting and worth pursuing. If scientific research has already answered the question of how frequent or intense the behavior or characteristic is, then you should consider turning it into a question about a relationship between that behavior or characteristic and some other variable. One way to do this is to ask yourself the following series of more general questions and write down all the answers you can think of. What are some possible causes of the behavior or characteristic? What are some possible effects of the behavior or characteristic? Right? So looking at causes and effects. What types of people might exhibit more or less of the behavior or characteristic? And what types of situations might elicit more or less of the behavior or characteristic? In general, each answer you write down can be conceptualized as a second variable, suggesting a question about a relationship. If you're interested in talkativeness, for example, it might occur to you that a possible cause of this psychological characteristic is family size. Is there a relationship between family size and talkativeness? Or it might occur to you that people seem to be more talkative in same-sex groups than mixed-sex groups. Is there a difference in the average level of talkativeness of people in same-sex groups and people in mixed-sex groups? This approach should allow you to generate many different empirically testable questions about almost any behavior or psychological characteristic. If through this process you generate a question that has never been studied scientifically, which again is something you'll learn in the lit review, then it might be interesting and worth pursuing. But what if you find that it's been studied scientifically? Although novice researchers often want to give up and move on to a new question at this point, that's not necessarily a good strategy. For one thing, the fact that the question has been studied scientifically and the research published suggests that it is of interest to the scientific community. For another, the question can almost certainly be refined so that its answer will still contribute something new to the research literature. Again, asking yourself a series of more general questions about the relationship is a good strategy. Are there other ways to define and measure the variables? Are there types of people for whom the relationship might be stronger or weaker? Are there situations in which the relationship might be stronger or weaker, including situations with practical importance? For example, research has shown that women and men speak about the same number of words per day, but this was when talkativeness was measured in terms of the number of words spoken per day among university students in the United States and Mexico. We can still ask whether other ways of measuring talkativeness, Perhaps the number of different people spoken to each day produce the same results. Or we can ask whether studying elderly people or people from another culture produces the same result. Again, this approach should help you generate many different research questions about almost any relationship. Evaluating research questions. Researchers usually generate many more questions than they ever attempt to answer. This means that they must have some way of evaluating the research questions they generate so that they can choose which ones to pursue. In this section, we'll consider two criteria for evaluating research questions: the interestingness of the question and the feasibility of answering it. How often do people tie their shoes? Do people feel pain when you punch them in the jaw? Are women more likely to wear makeup than men? Do people prefer vanilla or chocolate ice cream? Although it would be a fairly simple matter to design a study and collect data to answer these questions, you probably wouldn't want to because they're not very interesting. We're not talking here about whether a research question is interesting to us personally, but whether it's interesting to people more generally, and especially to the scientific community. But what makes a research question interesting in this sense? Here we look at three factors that affect the interestingness of a research question. If the answer is in doubt, the answer fills a gap in the research literature, and the answer has important practical implications. First, a research question is interesting to the extent that the answer is in doubt. Obviously, questions that have been answered by scientific research are no longer interesting as the subject of new empirical research. But the fact that a question has not been answered by scientific research does not necessarily make it interesting. There has to be some reasonable chance that the answer to the question will be something that we did not already know. But how can you assess this before actually collecting data? One approach is to try to think of reasons to expect different answers to the question, especially ones that seem to conflict with common sense. If you can think of reasons to expect at least two different answers, then the question might be interesting. If you can think of reasons to expect only one answer, then it's probably not. The question of whether women are more talkative than men is interesting because there are reasons to expect both answers. The existence of the stereotype itself suggests the answer could be yes, but the fact that women's and men's verbal abilities are fairly similar suggests the answer could be no. The question of whether people feel pain when you punch them in the jaw is not interesting because there's absolutely no reason to think the answer could be anything other than a resounding yes. A second important factor to consider when deciding if a research question is interesting is whether answering it will fill a gap in the research literature. Again, this means in part that the question has not already been answered by scientific research. But it also means that the question is in some sense a natural one for people who are familiar with the research literature. For example, the question of whether taking lecture notes by hand can improve students' exam performance would be likely to occur to anyone who was familiar with research on note-taking and the ineffectiveness of shallow processing on learning. A final factor to consider when deciding whether a research question is interesting is whether its answer has important practical implications. Again, the question of whether taking notes by hand improves learning has important implications for education, including classroom policies concerning technology use. This is why some of your professors may say that you are not allowed to take notes on laptops during their class. The question of whether cell phone use impairs driving is interesting because it's relevant to the personal safety of everyone who travels by car and to the debate over whether cell phone use should be restricted by law. Feasibility. A second important criteria for evaluating research questions is the feasibility of successfully answering them. There are many factors that affect feasibility, including time, money, equipment, materials, technical knowledge and skill, and access to research participants. That one is very important. Clearly, researchers need to take these factors into account so they don't waste time and effort pursuing research that they cannot complete successfully. Looking through a sample of professional journals in psychology will reveal many studies that are complicated and difficult to carry out. These include longitudinal designs in which participants are tracked over many years. neuroimaging studies in which participants' brain activity is measured while they carry out various mental tasks, and complex non-experimental studies involving several variables and complicated statistical analyses. Keep in mind, though, that such research tends to be carried out by teams of highly trained researchers whose work is often supported in part by government and private grants. Also keep in mind that research does not have to be complicated or difficult to produce interesting and important results. Looking through a sample of professional journals will also reveal studies that are relatively simple and easy to carry out, perhaps involving a convenient sample of college students and a paper and pencil task. A final point here is that it's generally good practice to use methods that have already been used successfully by other researchers. Students often feel they have to come up with a novel or new way to test something, when really, if somebody's already shown an effective way to do it, it's far better to use that method. For example, if you want to manipulate people's moods to make some of them happy, it would be a good idea to use one of the many approaches that have been used successfully by other researchers. For example, paying them a compliment. This is good not only for the sake of feasibility, the approach is tried and true, but also because it provides greater continuity with previous research. This makes it easier to compare your results with those of other researchers and to understand the implications of their research for yours and vice versa. Here are the sources that were used in this section.